Jamie, the mail's here. Mailman needs your signature for a package. I looked up at the call, a grin spreading across my face. Okay, just tell him to give me a second. I returned my focus to the subject in front of me, pressing my eye to the viewfinder and focusing the lens. Okay, Rachel, smile and say cheese. The slightly annoyed teenager forced a smile, and I pressed down on the shutter button. Ever since I was a kid, I've been obsessed with photography. There was always a camera in my hands, and I was always taking pictures of something, whether it was a person, a lake, or even just an oddly bent clump of grass that intrigued me. It became such a fixation of mine that I eventually began a photography business, taking photos for people's weddings, graduations, and more. It was a job I loved, and the money was far beyond adequate. And, just as importantly, it helped me fund my other obsession, collecting old photos. I loved scouring sites like eBay for collections of old photographs from long ago, decades, centuries even. Especially portraits of people. For whatever reason, seeing the faces of people who have long since passed filled me with a sense of peace, as strange as that may seem. You see, I've always had this fear of, when I die, being forgotten about, simply drifting into obscurity with not a trace of me left. The old portraits were a reminder, a metaphorical comfort blanket. They showed me that, if these people still have some sort of mark remaining on this world, many years after their passing, then the same may eventually be true of me. And so, I became their caretaker, even opening a small gallery next door to my photography studio that people could walk through and see my collection. And for years, everything went swimmingly, until my latest shipment came in last week. I pulled away from the tripod-mounted camera and nodded at the girl. Okay, we're all done here, I proclaimed, to which she let out a relieved sigh and shoved herself off the chair. I turned to the girl's mother, who stood beside me. Mrs. Douglas, if you'll excuse me, I need to grab that before the man gets impatient. Addie will be in here in a minute, and she'll let you know when the pictures will be ready to pick up, as well as have you pay. The haggard-looking woman gave me a thankful nod and tired smile, and I turned away, walking to the front of the studio as I heard her daughter begin to complain. Really, Mom? You needed me to take 10 pictures for a damn passport photo. I shook my head as I moved out of earshot. Some people will never like having their picture taken, no matter what it's for, unless it's one of those ridiculous selfies, of course. Coming around the corner to the front desk, I motioned for Addie, my girlfriend and assistant, to go and finish attending to the mother and daughter, then slid behind the counter where the impatient mailman waited opposite. Afternoon, I said, trying to lighten the mood, but the poor man had clearly had a bad day. He nodded curtly, then held out a small computer terminal. Sign here, please, he said. As soon as my signature was accepted, he turned and strode out of the building, banging the glass door a little too hard. But my focus was already on the large, brown paper-wrapped package held in my grasp. I vaguely heard the mother and daughter say farewell as they exited, and distractedly raised a hand to wave to them. My attention never pulled away from it, until I heard my name being called. Earth to Jamie, are there any more customers today? Giving a slightly embarrassed smile, I shook my head. Nope, those were the last. A smile of her own flicked across her face, and she turned, reaching up and locking the front door before turning the sign hanging on it from open to closed. She came over to the opposite side of the counter, leaning over it and locking her green eyes on the package in my hands. Another one, she asked, shaking her head slightly as she pushed her hair behind her ear. Addie didn't exactly share my passion for old photographs. In fact, she honestly found some of them creepy as fuck, in her own words. But, because she loved me, she dealt with it and put up with them. It was one of the many reasons I intended to eventually marry the woman. There weren't many like her left in the world. Well, then, let's head into the gallery and take a look at them, she declared, gesturing to the door which separated the studio and gallery. Excitedly, I led the way to the door, opening it and revealing the huge room. Photos and portraits of all sizes hung from the walls, displaying people from as far back as 2 centuries ago to as recently as the 1970s or 1980s. Gruff, mustached men wearing suits stared out next to families in swimsuits beaming at the camera, providing a sort of clash between antiquity antiquity and modernity. I turned on the lights, banishing away the heavy evening shadows before moving to the large table in the middle of the room. I set the package down, a grin splitting my face as I began ripping the packaging off like I was a kid unwrapping a Christmas present. Slowly but surely, the brown paper began showing glimpses of what lay beneath, and a few moments later, I stepped back to admire my newest purchases. While I breathed, sitting on the table were two portrait-sized photographs, which had been stacked on top of one another. Two black and white faces, one smiling and one not, stared up at us. The smiling face was that of a woman dressed in 1950s clothing. An ornate belt was wrapped around her waist, and she had on what looked to be a white turtleneck. Her blonde hair was done up in a style similar to what the blonde bombshells of the period would have worn, and her voluptuous lips were pulled back in a genuine smile that managed to warm my heart just looking at it. For whatever reason, I almost felt transfixed staring at her, until I heard Addie speak next to me. Wow is right. My eyes flickered over to the second photo, the one which had caught her attention. This one captured what appeared to be a man from the 1920s or 1930s. He was dressed in a sharp-looking suit and hat, standing in front of what appeared to be some sort of factory or warehouse. He wore an almost deadly serious face, his dark, stormy eyes glaring out at the viewer with an almost insane intensity. Even though he was eternally frozen behind the glass and metal frame, he gave off a truly menacing atmosphere. I let out an astonished gasp. "Can we say mobster, anybody?" Addie snorted. "Mobster serial killer is more of the apt description. It's fucking unnerving," she shivered, then looked over at the photo of the woman and let out a groan. "Oh, great. And to top it off, we now have the type of woman I'd be afraid to leave you alone in a room with, as well." I raised an eyebrow at her remark. Usually, Addie was one of the most confident and secure women I'd ever met. Even when other women tried making a pass at me, she usually just sat there, laughing and shaking her head at their attempts since she knew I wouldn't wander. But now, she stared at the smiling face as though she'd just met her nemesis. I was extremely grateful that she hadn't seen me become entranced over her a moment ago. She absolutely would have made you either throw it out or send it back. "You're not gonna bring them back to the house to clean up, are you?" she asked, sighing slightly as she already knew the answer. "Yes, I am," I replied, then gestured to the frames. "The glass and frames need polishing and cleaning before I set them up here in the gallery on Monday. It'll take all weekend to get them ready. Plus, all the cleaning equipment is at home anyways." She sighed again, resigned. "Fine, just please don't let me see them, okay babe?" For my part, I simply nodded. I wanted to say more, but I knew this was just par for the course, if not a slightly more exaggerated case than normal. My phone suddenly vibrated in my pocket, and I pulled it out to look at the notification. Seeing it was from eBay, I immediately put it back. Just a notification of it being delivered. Addie spoke again. "Well, if you don't mind, let's get ready to go home. It's getting late, and I was hoping we could celebrate Friday by going to that restaurant on the bay for dinner." A sly smile spread across her face. "And then a little fun for dessert when we get home." I couldn't help but let out a laugh at her flirt, turning to smirk at her. "Now that sounds like one hell of a plan." She laughed in return and turned, motioning for me to follow her as she headed back into the studio to shut everything down. I stood up and began to follow her. I got halfway across the room when a feeling rolled over me like a tidal wave, causing me to freeze in place. At first, I couldn't place what the feeling was, but as a shiver shot up my spine, I suddenly realized it was the feeling of being watched. I'd spent countless hours in the gallery before, and never before have I had the feeling of eyes on me like I did in that moment. What the hell? Is someone hiding in here? More than once I'd caught a few teenagers trying to hide in the gallery at night, on dares from their dumbass friends in order to spend the night in the creepy gallery. Sighing, I called out over my shoulder, "If anyone's in here, we're closed. Time for you to leave." Nobody answered me, but the feeling of being watched seemed to intensify. Another shiver shot up my spine as I felt a slight sense of unease fall on me. This didn't feel like a teenager. This felt like whoever was doing the staring had much more malicious intentions. Oh shit, not a freaking burglar. A small wave of fear suddenly swept through me at the thought. I was in decent shape, but I hadn't been in a fight in a long time. The feeling suddenly crescendoed, as though whoever were doing the staring were almost directly behind me. Raw instinct took over, and I spun around, my fists swinging. Into nothing. Nobody stood behind me. My head swung like it was on a swivel, eyes darting from one side of the room to the other. Nothing moved in the room, the only sound, aside from my now heavy breathing, being the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. What the fuck? I whispered. I'd been so sure someone had been behind me. My eyes fell across the portraits on the desk. I'd placed them into holders for the moment, and both were slightly tilted up. Both the smiling woman and glowering man stared at me from across the room. I shook my head. You tired or something, Jamie? You've gotta be if you're imagining feeling eyes on you in an empty room. Deciding I'd try and get to sleep relatively early tonight, I turned away, choosing to close the door to the gallery behind me. I spent most of the next day in the basement of our house, diligently working on getting the photos ready for their debut exhibition next week, while Addie went into town to attend the farmer's market. Each new purchase I made drew curious patrons to see what I'd found, and this was certainly going to be no exception, especially after I'd teased their arrival on social media. The feeling I'd had the other day in the gallery hadn't followed me home, thankfully. Told you it was just you being tired, I muttered to myself as I cleaned the glass of the woman's photo. My eyes flickered to her face for a moment, then away quickly. As odd as it felt, and as, admittedly, guilty as I had started to feel, I couldn't help but become entranced by her eyes and smile every time my gaze caught it. Butterflies seemed to leap up in my stomach, as though I were a high schooler seeing my crush for the first time. It was something I hadn't felt for anyone else since I'd started dating Addie. It's a damn picture, I said out loud. It's not like she's still alive, so why should I feel guilty about finding a woman beautiful who I couldn't possibly leave Addie for? Still, I felt a twinge of shame and turned to clean the glass of the man's picture. I didn't look at his face either, but this was for an entirely different reason. Even though he was long past harming anyone, you couldn't help but shiver at how intimidating he looked. As I leaned forward to begin cleaning the glass, I became aware of a strange, new smell filling the room. I stopped for a moment, sniffing the air. Perfume. Addie wasn't one to wear perfume much anymore, and besides, this didn't smell like the kind she'd wear for special occasions. It was powerful, almost intoxicating in its intensity. I turned around, looking over my shoulder. The single, widely spaced out lights illuminating the basement showed nobody else was down here besides me. Maybe there's a crack in one of the basement windows that let the smell in. You've put off replacing those for almost a year anyways. Shaking it away, I turned back to finish cleaning the glass. The smell came again after a few minutes. This time, I chose to simply ignore it, focusing, but still feeling somewhat relaxed by the pleasant aroma. I began to hum the melody of the Incubus song Drive to myself. That was when I felt the fingers brush the nape of my neck. It was only for a split second, and the sensation wasn't exactly unpleasant, like that of a lover's gentle caress, but it still caused me to let out an involuntary gasp and spin around on my stool. I half expected to see Addie behind me, a playful expression adorning her face from sneaking up on me, but again, nobody was there. I didn't turn back this time. Instead, my eyes peered into the far corners of the basement. The shadows were heavy there, and I couldn't see beyond 30 or 40 feet. I took a deep breath, then called out softly, hello. My voice sounded muted against the stone walls and floor. Silence. You're getting jumpy again, Jamie, my mind mentally chided me. What the hell, might as well just check for peace of mind, I whispered, then stood up. I began walking towards the far end of the room, which was half concealed by shelves of cleaning supplies and boxes. Hello, is anyone there? I called out again, my voice a bit stronger. Again, I received no answer, but something in the air seemed to have changed. I could still smell the perfume, but the room seemed charged now somehow, as if everything in it were holding its breath and waiting for something. I took a few more steps, and then all the lights in the basement went out. I was plunged into pitch blackness, unable to keep from letting out a surprised cry. I stood there for a few moments, trying to will my breathing to slow. It's just some sort of power outage. They happen all the time. You know this, Jamie. Just make your way to the fuse box by the stairs, where the flashlight is hanging. I turned and began slowly moving in the direction I thought the stairs were. Scrape. I froze at the sound when I couldn't tell which direction it had come from. The seconds seemed to move by at a snail's pace. I was just beginning to tell myself that it had been nothing when the sound came again. Scrape. My mouth suddenly went dry as cotton, and I felt my heart begin to beat like a drum in my chest. The sound came a third time, just like the last two instances. I couldn't tell from where. They seemed to echo in the darkness. I forced my eyes open as far as they could go, willing them to get used to the black. But I still saw nothing, not even the side of my nose. A fourth scrape came, and as much as I know it was a stupid decision to make, I forced my mouth open and called out, trying to make my voice sound as intimidating as possible. "Who's there?" Instantly, the scraping stopped, the basement going silent. Eerily silent. "Shit, that was a mistake, you freaking idiot." I felt like the moron in a horror movie who deserved to get murdered for that move. If someone isn't here with you, you just gave away your exact position. My breaths came slow and shallow as I tried to limit the amount of noise I made. I couldn't hear anyone else breathing in the dark, but the atmosphere in the basement had taken on an almost palpable sense of foreboding. Fear like I hadn't felt since I was a kid flooded into my system, and I slowly began to try and move for the stairwell upstairs. All I needed to do was make it to them, and then sprint up the less than a dozen steps to the door. I'd barely taken 3 steps when 2 things happened almost simultaneously. The first was that a voice suddenly cried out into the darkness. A woman's voice, one that had a strong British accent to it, filled with a frantic panic. "Look out." The second was the explosion of sound and movement that came from a few feet to my left. Adrenaline flooded my system as I heard the thundering sound of footsteps rushing towards me. "Shit," I yelled out, leaping back a few feet. Something passed by in front of me, close enough that I felt the air stir. A moment later, a thundering crash came, followed by the sound of breaking glass and plastic clattering to the stone floor. Whoever it was just missed me by less than a foot. For the rest of my life, the realization I'd been that close to being ambushed will haunt me. The sound of someone trying to clamber to their feet came from my right, and a new surge of fear slammed into me. I knew that if I waited for them to get to their feet, I was not making it out of this basement alive. The woman's voice suddenly rang out again from the dark. "Run." I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted forward, praying I knew where I was going. Behind me, I heard the person who'd rushed me finally begin moving again. For a moment, I was terrified that I'd be grabbed from behind and pulled back to a horrible fate. Instead, I felt a surge of energy rush through me as I felt my feet find the steps. Not bothering to grab the banister, I tore up the stairs, my hands outstretched. Someone, what sounded like a man, swore loudly behind me, but my fingers had already found the doorknob, and I tore at it like a tiger would a slab of meat. The door flew open, and I fell forward in a heap on the kitchen floor. For a second, the wind was knocked out of me, and I lay groaning on the tile, until I heard the sound of someone charging up the stairs after me. I leapt to my feet and slammed the door closed, locking it and yanking the key out. Not a moment too soon, either. Someone slammed violently into the other side with a great amount of force, then began hammering on it. The door shuddered with each impact, to the point I feared it'd break down at any moment. The rational side of my brain kicked in, and I turned to run for the living room where my cell phone was. "I'm calling the cops, asshole," I screamed as I sprinted away. The pounding continued on the door for a few more moments, and then I heard the sound of someone thundering back down the basement steps as I dialed 911. As the dispatcher came on the line, an eerie silence settled over the house. I heard no sound come from inside, no sound from outside either, aside from the distant rumbling of the waves on the shore and the gentle whistle of the wind against the windows. It was only broken as I began to hear the wailing sounds of the sirens approaching. When the police arrived, I was immediately ordered to wait outside as officers swarmed in, taking the basement door key in order to gain access downstairs. For a few minutes, I heard the sounds of them shouting, ordering anyone to come out with their hands up. Then they appeared back in the doorway, gesturing to me. "Was the storm door on the far side of the basement locked, sir?" one asked me as he led me back towards the kitchen. I racked my brain, trying to recall whether I'd bolted it the other day or not. A sinking feeling filled my stomach as I realized I hadn't, and I shook my head. "That explains where he went, then," he said, then escorted me down the stairs to the basement, which now had its lights on again. The first thing I saw was the shelves which had toppled over onto their sides. Bottles and glasses of photo cleaning supplies lay shattered on the floor, along with boxes of strewn clothing and laundry detergent. The intruder crashed into here, and after trying to pursue up the stairs, escaped out the storm door when he heard you were calling the police. I gazed at the mess, wondering how I was going to explain any of this to Addie without her freaking out. When I remembered I'd forgotten to tell both the dispatcher and the officers about the woman that had warned me, but for whatever reason, something kept me from saying anything. A thought that kept pushing forward in my mind. As much as I tried telling myself it was impossible, the officers promised me they'd sweep the surrounding forest to try and find the guy, as well as keep a squad car parked across the street for the night. in case he tried to return. With a final reminder for me to lock the storm door, they left. Immediately I bolted back into the basement and locked the metal doors to the outside. Feeling a little relieved by the action, I bent down, catching my breath as I began to try and piece together what I'd say to Addie when she got home. That was when the thought I'd had wormed its way forward again, unable to be pushed away. "No, that's absolutely freaking insane for you to think," I declared out loud. But my voice didn't sound sure. The thought kept repeating. Taking a deep breath, I walked back over to where the two pictures still sat on their cleaning easels. My eyes fell over the picture of the woman, and again, I felt the same pull I'd had every time I looked at it. But this time, a new sense of warmth flooded through me as well. I looked at the smiling face, and as much as I chided myself for even considering such an idea, I couldn't help but speak out loud. "Did you warn me?" Of course, the picture didn't answer me, nor did any voice suddenly come from behind me. In reality, it was likely that the intruder had an accomplice, a woman that had grown a conscience, and decided to alert me to the other's presence. Still, the thought remained, and I couldn't help but remember the smell of perfume and the sensation against the back of my neck. For whatever reason, it caused me to smile. That was when I looked over at the other picture. The sight of what I'd decided had to have been some kind of mobster sent a shiver through my spine, and the dark, intense glare reminded me of how I'd felt in the darkness. For a moment, the fear I'd felt returned, and then I shook my head. "You're just shaken up over what happened, Jamie, and understandably so. Don't let your imagination get the best of you." Even still, I took a drop cloth from a nearby workbench and draped it over the man's picture. I cast one last look back at the picture of the woman as I moved towards the stairs. For a moment, I swear I thought her smile widened a little, thought I saw a warm twinkle in her eyes. Then I shook my head, turning and flicking off the lights before heading quickly upstairs. I kept telling myself that, as terrifying as the experience had been, it was over, that I wouldn't have to worry about it again. I had no idea that the most terrifying and horrific things were still to come. Thank you to my superfans, Sweet Black Swan, Tacy, and Brooklyn. I really appreciate you guys supporting my channel, and I look forward to making more content for everyone.